Today I'm going to show you how to build a secret compartment box just like this one using a 2x4. My first step was to chop this wood down and make it a little easier to work with. Using the jointer, I flattened two sides of every board. I referenced those two sides on all the following cuts to make sure my boards are perfectly square. Now I'm bringing the thickness down to a little over an inch. These boards are flat, square, and parallel, so I chopped them in half with the bandsaw. Now I'm going to book match these boards and glue them together using Titebond 3, so I'll have some decent sized material to work with. Now I'm going to cut these down at the table saw to create the four sides of the box. It'll be roughly 9 inches by 6 inches by 6 inches. Using the router table, I cut rabbets in the short sides. Now I'm using the table saw to cut 2 grooves for the bottom and the false bottom. To get the 1/4 inch that I need, after the first cut, I move my fence over just a little bit and take another pass. The grooves are about 7/8 of an inch apart. I'm using 1/4 inch baltic birch plywood for the bottom and the false bottom. Now I glue up 3 of the 4 sides and the actual bottom. I leave the false bottom and the 4th side loose so I can fit everything together later. I put a little wax mixture on the inside corners of the false bottom to keep it from accidentally getting glued in place. This is when I find out if the wax worked. It did. I'm using clear pine for the secret compartment blank since it's more stable than a 2x4. I leave it extra long and extra thick so I can trim it down to fit perfectly. I make multiple passes on the thickness planer to get the thickness just right.
Like a glove.
Once I have the blank fitting perfectly, I cut a small piece of the excess off to make a spring block. And I glue that in at the back. To make the hole in the side of the box, I use a drill press to remove the majority of the material. And using the cavity as a template with a bottom bearing router bit, I clean up the hole. Things get a little bit tricky here because we have to line up the lock spring.
This little thing.
We have a simple 4-sided box, and we have to know how thick our liner is going to be. You should have the spring block in at this point. The little red square is the removable section of the liner, and that's where your locking spring needs to line up. This is what my compartment is going to look like with the top left corner overlapping the removable section of the liner. That allows the pin to contact the spring when the liner section is flipped around. To lay this out, start by installing the false bottom. Slide in the secret compartment blank and push it all the way up against the spring. Mark that line, pull it out, install the 4th side, and mark the inside line. I cut off a small piece of my liner stock and use it to mark the thickness. The tip of the lock spring needs to end up between those lines. Then I transfer those measurements over to the blank and lay out my compartment. There are 100 different ways to cut out the compartment. I use a CNC router, but since I don't want to hear everybody whining that they don't have one, I'm not even going to bother showing this. Bam! Now it's time to fit the spring. This little riser is about 2 inches long and a 1/4 inch thick. I use it to prop up the spring. I'm going to use brass for the spring on this box, but anything springy could work. I've done it with wood in the past with no issues. Now I'm going to make a corresponding groove in the false bottom. Slide the false bottom all the way to the back. Push the compartment all the way to the back against the spring and make that line again. Now I measure the distance from the line to the tip of the spring, and then I put the compartment back in to mark the location of the spring because I forgot to do it the first time. Then I transfer those measurements over to the false bottom using a caliper and a marking gauge. That little thing is called the marking gauge. Then I attack those lines savagely with a chisel. I carve out the material until it's a couple mils deep. Cue test fit with satisfying click. That's it. I mark the center of the groove on the other side of the false bottom, so I know where to drill out once the case is fully assembled. Don't drill any holes just yet. It's finally time to glue in the false bottom and the fourth side. A quick file to get the rounded corners square. And using an extra long 1/8 inch drill bit, I drill out the hole I just marked. With that hole drilled, I can test fit, make sure everything still lines up, and it does. The piece I'm using as the lid is slightly oversized, so I can trim it flush with the router. Now I lop the top of the box off at the bandsaw. I cut the liner stock to height at about 3/8 of an inch taller than the inside of the box. Then I cut the 4 pieces on the table saw sled. I cut rabbets just like I did on the outside of the box, but for the liner you do it to the long sides. That little pre-cut is to prevent tear out. This requires some finesse, but once it's fitting, I glue it in place. Then I glue in the non-removable short side. I make my feet by cutting a long piece with a 45-degree angle and chopping that piece in half at the bandsaw. Well, nearly half. I tape the 2 pieces together and lay down some glue. Fold it up and tape it some more. The tape provides more than enough clamping pressure. Then I can cut 4 identical feet on the table saw sled. I use some scrap 1/4 inch ply as a spacer while I glue the feet on, making sure that the feet don't cover the hole. Next, I'll set the release pin into the removable section of the liner. This piece of scrap helps to hold the pin in place. The pin is made out of 1/8 inch brass rod that I've sanded a slight taper into. It gets placed in the hole tapered down. I slide the liner section into place and push it hard against the pin to leave an indentation. Now I drill the hole and set the pin. I'll flip the liner around and put it back in place. Give it a slight tap to leave another indentation. I drill that hole out directly into the secret compartment. That way the pin will act as a fail-safe lock. Locked. Released. Locked. Now I mark the secret compartment tray so I can trim it flush. Now I fit the 4 trim pieces and glue them in place. I'm very careful with glue placement on the secret compartment side because I don't want to glue the whole thing shut at this stage. I pare a little bit off the outside edge of the liner so that the lid doesn't fit too tight. I'm purposely doing a rough job, and you'll see why in a few minutes. I clamp the lid in place so it doesn't move around while I'm placing the hinges. I use an awl to mark the hinge holes and pre-drill them with a 1/16 inch drill bit. These brass screws have a tendency to strip, so I use a little bit of wax on the threads to make sure they go in nice. There's no good way to make this box look like it was built out of anything other than a 2x4, so I'm just going to distress it by rounding the corners over, giving it some good scars, and just generally roughing it up. I'm using atrocious sanding techniques with some 220 grit. Now I'll do my best to give it a horribly splotchy staining. I start this by staining all the edges, corners, and tight spots, where buildup would typically be if this was older than it actually is. Then I try to do a horrible job on the rest of the box. I was really disappointed with how good the color came out. I think this Varathane wood stain is idiot proof. A couple hours later, I hit it with some brie wax. The solvent in the wax pulled a lot of the color off and gave it that distressed look that I wanted, with all the dark spots in the edges and corners. Thanks for watching. There's more details in the description, and don't forget to check out my Patreon page if you love what I do.